Episode 14.
Very well. If you want to go all through life suffering from a noise deficiency, I'll give it all to the din for his lunch, he said, and he uncorked the bottle with a hollow-sounding pop. For a moment, everything was quiet as Milo, Talk, and the humbug looked intently at the bottle, wondering what Dr. Discord would do next. Then, very faintly at first, they heard a low rumbling that sounded miles away. It grew louder and louder and closer and closer and closer until it became a deafening, ear-splitting roar that seemed to be coming from inside the tiny bottle. Then, from the bottle, a thick bluish smog spiraled to the ceiling, spread out, and gradually assumed the shape of a thick bluish smog with hands, feet, bright yellow eyes, and a large frowning mouth. As soon as the smog had gotten completely out of the bottle, it grasped the beaker of liquid, tilted back what would have been its head if it really had one, and drank it all in 3 gulps.
"Ah, that was good, master,"
he bellowed, shaking the whole wagon.
"I thought you'd never let me out. Terribly cramped in there."
"This is my assistant, the awful din," said Dr. Discord. "You must forgive his appearance, for he really doesn't have any. You see, he is an orphan whom I raised myself without benefit of governess or any other assistance for—"
"No nurse is good nurse,"
interrupted the din, doubling up with laughter. If you can imagine a thick bluish smog doubling up with laughter. "For I found him," continued the doctor, ignoring this outburst,
"living alone and unwanted in an abandoned soda bottle, without family or relatives. No niece is good niece,"
roared the din again, with a laugh that sounded like several sirens going off at once, and he slapped where his knee should have been.
"And brought him here,"
continued the exasperated Discord,
"where, despite his lack of shape or features, I trained—" "No nose is good nose,"
thundered the din once again as he collapsed in another fit of hysterics and clutched his sides.
"I trained him as my assistant in the business of concocting and dispensing noise,"
finished the doctor, mopping his brow with a handkerchief.
"No noise is good noise,"
exclaimed the humbug happily, trying to catch the spirit of things.
"That's not funny at all,"
sobbed the din, who went to a corner and sulked. "What is a din?" asked Milo when he had recovered from the shock of seeing him appear.
"You mean to say you've never met the awful din before?"
said Dr. Discord in a surprised tone.
"Why, I thought everyone had. When you're playing in your room and making a great amount of noise, what do they tell you to stop?"
"That awful din," admitted Milo.
"When the neighbors are playing their radio too loud late at night, what do you wish they'd turn down?"
"That awful din," answered Talk.
"When the street on your block is being repaired and the pneumatic drills are working all day, what does everyone complain of?" "The dreadful row,"
volunteered the humbug brightly.
"The dreadful row," cried the anguished din, "was my grandfather. He perished in the great silence epidemic of 1712.
Milo felt so sorry for the unhappy din that he gave him his handkerchief, which was immediately covered in bluish, smoggy tears.
"Thank you," groaned the din. "That's very kind, but I certainly can't understand why you don't like noise," he said. "Why, I heard an explosion last week that was so lovely I cried for 2 days.
The very thought of it upset him so much that he began to sob all over again, in a way that sounded almost exactly like a handful of fingernails being scratched across a mile-long blackboard. He buried his head in the doctor's lap. "He's very sensitive, isn't he?" asked Milo, trying to comfort the emotional din.
"It's true,"
agreed Dr. Discord.
"but he's right, you know, for noise is the most valuable thing in the world."
"King Azaz says words are," said Milo.
"Nonsense!"
the doctor roared.
"Why, when a baby wants food, how does he ask?"
"It screams," answered the din, looking up happily.
"And when an automobile wants gas,
"It chokes," he shouted again, jumping for joy. "When a river wants water, what does it do?" "It creaks," bellowed the din, as he collapsed into a fit of uncontrolled laughter.
"And what happens when a new day begins?"
"It breaks," he gasped joyfully from the floor, a look of utter bliss covering his face.
"You see how simple it is,"
the doctor said to Milo, who didn't see at all. And then, turning to the tear-stained, smiling din, he remarked,
"Isn't it time for you to go?"
"Where to?" asked Milo. "Perhaps we're going the same way."
"I think not,"
the din replied, picking up an armful of empty sacks from the table.
"For I'm going on my noise collection rounds. You see, once a day I travel throughout the kingdom and collect all the wonderfully horrible and beautifully unpleasant noises that have been made, pack them into my sacks, and bring them back here for the doctor to make his medicines from."
"And a good job he does," said Dr. Discord, pounding his fist on the table.
"So wherever the noise is, that's where you'll find me,"
said the din with an appreciative smile.
"And I must hurry along, for I understand that today there's going to be a screech, several loud clashes, and a bit of pandemonium."
"And in which direction are you going?" asked the doctor, mixing another brew. "To Digitopolis," replied Milo.
"How unfortunate,"
he said, as the din shuffled toward the door.
"How very unfortunate, for then you must pass through the Valley of Sound." "Is that bad?"
asked the perpetually worried humbug. The din paused in the doorway with a look of extreme horror on his almost featureless face, and the doctor shuddered in a way that sounded very much like a fast-moving freight train being derailed into a mountain of custard.
"Well, you might ask, for you will find out soon enough,"
was all he would say as he sadly bade them farewell, and the din galloped off on his rounds. Chapter 12. The Silent Valley. "How agreeable and pleasant this valley is," thought Milo, as once again they bounced along the highway, with the humbug humming snatches of old songs to his own vast amusement, and Talk sniffing contentedly at the wind. "I really don't see what Dr. Discord was so concerned about. There certainly couldn't be anything unpleasant along this road." And just as the thought crossed his mind, they passed through a heavy stone gateway, and everything was different. At first it was difficult to tell just what had changed. It all looked the same, and it all smelled the same, but for some reason nothing sounded the same. "I wonder what's happened," said Milo. At least that's what he tried to say, for although his lips moved, not a sound came from his mouth. And suddenly he realized what it was, for Talk was no longer ticking, and the humbug, although happily singing, was doing so in complete silence. The wind no longer rustled the leaves, the car no longer squeaked, and the insects no longer buzzed in the fields. Not the slightest thing could be heard, and it felt as if in some mysterious way a switch had been thrown, and all the sound in the world had been turned off at the same instant. The humbug, suddenly realizing what had happened, leapt to his feet in terror, and Talk worriedly checked to see if he was still keeping time. It was certainly a strange feeling to know that no matter how loudly or softly you chatted or rattled or bumped, it all came out the same way, as nothing. How dreadful, thought Milo as he slowed down the car. The three of them began to talk and shout at once with absolutely no result, until, hardly noticing where they were going, they had driven into the midst of a large crowd of people marching along the road. Some of them were singing at the tops of their non-existent voices, and others were carrying large signs which proclaimed, "Down with silence! All quiet is no diet. It's laudable to be audible. More sound for all." And one enormous banner stated simply, "Hear, hear." Except for these, and the big brass cannon being pulled along behind, they all looked very much like the residents of any other small valley to which you've ever been. When the car had stopped, one of them held up a placard which said, "Welcome to the Valley of Sound," and the others cheered as loudly as possible, which was not very loud at all. "Have you come to help us?" asked another, stepping forward with his question. "Please," added a third. Milo tried desperately to say who he was and where he was going, but to no avail. As he did, 4 more placards announced, "Listen, look carefully, and we will tell you of our terrible misfortune."